dwellings that would have been there for a population of 2,000 people. What's interesting about it is Alois builds a little chapel, and he holds Catholic Mass. He baptizes, but he's relatively unsuccessful, and he writes back in his Jesuit records about how resistant the native people are to his proselytizing and how pagan they are, and he attributes it to their sloth. These are slothful people, they're lazy of mind, and they don't, he seems to say they don't get it. And so he has trouble, so he dedicates his efforts as best he can, but he says, I need help. There's a couple things that happen in his stay. As in spite of his efforts to convert, there's a fire in his little chapel and it burns down, and he blames the Huron. He says they set fire to the chapel because they're so resistant to my teachings. So he leaves in 1667. He's only there 2 years, 65 to 67. And he goes back to Sault Ste. Marie to get reinforcements, and he comes back with Father Nicholas by his side, now 2 priests, and they stay 1 more year and then abandon the mission altogether because of the resistance of the Huron, the Ojibwa, and the Ottawa to their teachings. So the mission is abandoned for several years until the most famous Jesuit in Wisconsin history for sure, Father Marquette, arrives in the fall, and Father Jacques Marquette arrives again at Chequamegon Bay. I'm going to quote from Marquette here from the Jesuit record. Here, south and west of the head of the bay, a half-dozen permanent villages. Now, he arrives less than 2 years later, so this is where it gets confusing. Alois reports 2 villages. Marquette says a half-dozen villages. So, what I'm guessing is that actually there are Ottawa, Huron, and Ojibwa spread from at least Bono Creek, probably farther north than that, Thompson's Creek, modern-day Washburn, all the way down that shore. There are, with concentrations at Bono Creek and Fish Creek, but small little groupings is what I would guess. Not so different from today if you go through Barksdale and Ashland. That's what Marquette reports, a half-dozen people, and he says, never have I seen so many Indians, and never have I met such indifference to the gospel as here.
He sounds surprised.
Yeah, he can't believe it. And so he has trouble as well. He said here again from Marquette's journal, it only rests with the missionaries to baptize the entire population, at least 2,000. However, they are too superstitious and will not surrender. They would cling to their pagan ways and customary beliefs. And thus he that's an unquote. So he encourages others who accompany him to, again, quote, share your efforts to baptize the dying, for they are a surer harvest.
Or the dead.
Quick before they relent. Marquette also, however, he arrives in 69, late 69. Marquette leaves in 1771, or 1671, I mean. He's only here 2 years. So the entire span of Jesuit missions to the western end of Lake Superior is only a very brief 6 or 7 years. Further, after Marquette leaves in 1671, it ends all missionary efforts on Lake Superior, for 160 years, until the Franciscans come and later Protestants. Into the middle of the 19th century, when Father Barraga begins to work among the Indians, and the Wheelers of Northland College fame come. 160 years, there are no more missionary efforts in the entire region. Why? Why is that? Marquette is famous for his missionary efforts further south and his explorations of the Mississippi. His namesake is the University of Marquette. The Jesuits begin to find success down the Mississippi. They establish outposts and so forth. And here he is in his various representations. By the way, again, the black robes, you can see. Well, here's where we get a little, I have to check my time, I think we're doing okay. There are many, many areas where the native populations, the Ojibwa or Anishinaabe, the Huron, the Ottawa, the Potawatomi, and the Jesuits' worldviews were perhaps incompatible, or at least they were so different that neither could understand what the other was attempting to communicate, or how each party understood the meaning, purpose, and destiny of life. And I want to talk very briefly about these, and then I'll end and try to leave some time for questions. I'm identifying 5 areas that are significant to religious studies and the study of comparative religion, which is a field that I care deeply about. These are big 2-bit words, but these are core ways in which humans find meaning and purpose. We all do this, whether we know it or not. And that is the areas of epistemology. How do we know? How do we know what we know? How do we know can we know anything for sure? And if so, what establishes that? So epistemology, how do we know what we know? Secondly, cosmogony, that is the origins. Where did everything come from? Where did it start? Along with where did it start, destiny, teleology, the knowledge of the end of things, is where is this going? If you know how it all started, does life have a destiny to it? Are we headed somewhere? And again, this plays out in all of our lives. We just don't use those words. And we may not have thought about it consciously, but all societies have some sense of how to transfer knowledge. How did this all start? What is its purpose and destiny? What is the nature of ultimate reality? Theology. And I use the word salvation. That's not a popular word anymore in common society, but all humans experience brokenness in their lives. How do you find healing? How do you find resolution to the wounds and hurts of life? All human societies have some sense of that. And all religions have some sense of soteriology, or how do I find salvation? How am I saved from the woes of this life? Well, very briefly, I'm going to focus mostly on Ojibwa spirituality and Ojibwa teachings in these 5 areas. Well, the first that I want to talk about a little bit here is epistemology. How do you know things, and how do you transmit knowledge? And in Ojibwa culture, as in all northern North American native cultures, but certainly among the Anishinaabe, is the world is made of stories. The truth of things is narrative, not discursive, not philosophical, not even mathematical, but story. The telling of stories is how you tell the truth of things, even deep truths of things. So the story of the origins of reality come again as the way you transmit deep knowledge. How do you tell the truth of things? You tell stories. And the stories reveal, again, the deepest meaning of our lives. So, for example, James St. Clair, a modern Anishinaabe scholar, says, we story ourselves into being. Or another way, he says that we story ourselves into our lives. We find the purpose and direction and meaning of our lives by the telling of our stories. our story, but especially the stories of our ancestors and the gods, or the Manitou. Everything is known through story, and you transmit then core knowledge by telling stories, no matter what it is. Sometimes I tell my students it's all the little kid questions of life that are nevertheless the great questions of life. Where did I come from? You know, why is the sky blue? Which again, these questions lead to all knowledge actually. Why does the bear have a short tail? Any question that a kid would ask that actually leads into a kind of deep knowledge, the way you explain that, the epistemology of the Anishinaabe is the epistemology of stories, and the way you transmit knowledge is to tell those stories. We're in the middle of storytelling time, the winter especially. Summer and spring and fall were for sowing, growing, and harvesting. Winter was for teaching. Winter is the time to tell the stories of who we are, where we came from, and where we're going. I'm reminded of, this is not a native person, but Umberto Eco, the great Italian writer. He says, in the end of it, narrative is all we have. Even science is a story using the language of mathematics. It's all a story. We're always telling stories. Tom Fitz will tell you, all geology is the story of rocks, the story that the really old ones are trying to tell. But that's for Fitz. I'm going to keep going and skip this, but Basil Johnson, again, a modern scholar in Ojibwa from Ontario, has written extensively about this, and he contrasts it significantly with Western epistemology, Western ways of knowing, and Jesuit Christians would have represented that. So that the Jesuit Christianity understanding of truth is that truth is revealed by doctrines, not stories. Now, modern Christians would argue that the New Testament and Old Testaments are nothing but narrative, but that's a recovery of the narrative tradition. In the Reformation and post-Reformation Jesuit culture, truth is told in abstract doctrines, and the Scripture is a record of doctrine. Contrast that with this kind of imaginative process, and then begin to think about how people can try to communicate it across that gulf of how you understand basic knowledge and how to transmit knowledge. That includes then the sense of origins. The origins, the cosmogony of the Ojibwa people include some extraordinary stories of Gitche and Sky Lady. I don't have time to tell these stories, but there's a beautiful story of Ojibwa origins that talks about the first creation and its collapse or failure and destruction by a flood, and its restoration and recreation. Not foreign to a Hebrew mind, but very foreign to a 16th century Jesuit mind. They didn't read the Old Testament the way the ancient Hebrew people would have told it, because that also was an oral, story-based culture. But 16th century Europeans didn't think with a Hebrew oral or narrative mind. They saw stories as support for doctrines and canon law, but not the native peoples. So the cosmogony included these beautiful stories, elaborate stories. The other thing about narrative in the Ojibwa or Anishinaabe tradition is that these stories are meant to be told aloud, and they are not meant to be precise or exact. So the story is allowed to morph or change given the circumstance that the community or the young people of the community are facing. So the story is not a fixed story, it's not a book. There was great resistance, even in the 20th century, to writing these stories down, out of fear that if you put them in print, it changes the very character of narrative and story.
But the message or the moral would have not have changed.
Exactly.
I imagine.
Yeah. The purpose was to, in fact, to keep the moral. Sometimes you have to tweak the story. But the moral never changes. You're exactly right. This is a rendering, by the way, of the creation story where Sky Lady comes down and is offered the back of a turtle to rest on in the great flood. And the great turtle becomes then not only her resting place, but with the work of all the animals in cooperation with one another, the back of the turtle becomes eventually land and continent, and hence we are all still standing on Turtle Island in the recreation story of the Ojibwa people.
It's interesting, in Asian cultures and religions, you often see the turtle, the tortoise, as the base on which everything rests.
Yeah. Also South American Aboriginal groups. Here's another rendering. This is by one of the most famous Ojibwa artists of modern era, Roy Thomas. You can see again the turtle. And notice the relationships of the creatures here. I do want to say just a quick word about that. I've got to really keep moving around. I'm going to be in trouble here. With the cosmogony and the creation story, I do want you to note the interrelationships of the creatures. All have their proper place. The plant creatures, the animals, the four-legged, the immaterial world, and this is first humans before they were fully formed. That's a whole long story, but the Anishinaabe, original man, before it became Anishinaabe, human. There's also a sense of destiny, and I wanted to mention that as well, as I said. The dimension of the destiny of the Ojibwa people includes a migration story where the Ojibwa or Anishinaabe, original man, begins his journey on the Atlantic and follows this migration route. There are all kinds of evidence of this sense of migration and destiny. So when I was talking about teleology or destiny, there is a deep sense among the Ojibwa that they were destined to this place. The Megas Shell led them to 7 historic stops on their migration. That this was a historic migration as significant as the migration of Abraham in the book of Genesis. In fact, William Warren, one of the earliest historians of the Ojibwa people, makes that explicit comparison. He says the Ojibwa story is similar to the story of Abraham. And he marks this, that this was God's will, that the Ojibwa would follow these 7 historic stops, that they are led along their way by mystical beings, including the eagle, but especially the Megas, sometimes by Mishapishu, who's kind of a trickster character, but here leads the travelers to their destiny. By the way, these pictographs are at Agua Rock. You literally walk out on this shelf. Have any of you seen this, by the way?
Where is it?
Yeah.
St. Clair Cove.
St. Clair Cove in Canada. I don't know, way up by
Yeah,
Wawa. Another. Say that again.
If you're looking at like the map, it'd be about like 2 o'clock on Lake Ontario. Kind of
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, yeah, I mean, Superior.
Yeah.
A group of us cross-country skied on the shore, on the edge of Lake Superior one winter and went to some photographs in northern Minnesota. And I have no idea where we were, but it was just, incredible.
Yeah, these are sacred sites. there are a number of pictographic and hieroglyphs in northern Minnesota, in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area, Lake of the Woods. Rainy Lake has a number of them.
Saginaw also has,
Yes.
has a lot.
Has a
And
lot.
Cache Bay and,
Yeah,
yeah.
That's about 4 hours north of Sault Ste. Marie going up this way.
yeah. So here's a depiction again of the migration of the Anishinaabe. Again, this is a traditional rendering of it. It's easier, again, for our purposes tonight to just notice the 7 historic stops include a turtle-shaped island, which is near Montreal, one of the islands of the river, Niagara Falls, the Detroit, Manitoulin Island, still huge population of Ojibwa in Manitoulin, Sault Ste. Marie, then Duluth, and then back to where the Megas shell rested over Punawani, the Madeline Island. The place where food grows upon the water is the traditional teachings that here you will find your destined home, where across from the place where food grows on water, which is
Wild
wild rice, Manoman. Yeah. Wild rice all over the place up here. I mean, right here. There's some beautiful wild rice beds still in this area. So the reason I wanted to talk about that is, again, there is a real sense of teleology here, that we are destined to this place. What's unique about that, I'll stay with this for just a minute. What I want you to think about is the sense of destiny for the Anishinaabe is primarily place-based. That the ultimate destiny of a people was to be in a place, to live in that place, to know that place, to live off that place. Contrast that with Jesuit Christianity for just a minute, because in most respects, Christianity, unlike predecessor Hebrew religion or Judaism, Christianity is largely a place-less religion. It's a portable religion, which is its power. I mean, that's why it had sort of extraordinary missionary reach. But it is a religion without a sense of place, because the teleology of Christianity, where is one's ultimate destiny and home? It's not here. It's heaven. In fact, we are strangers. We are sojourners in this life. This is not, we don't quite belong here. At least you see that strain in Christianity. And both have a teleology, but and Ojibwa certainly have a sense of an afterlife. But their primary purpose in this life is to be grounded in a place that was destined by Gitchimanidu. I gotta really hustle. Theology, that is a sense of ultimate reality or God and gods. The theology of the Ojibwa or Anishinaabe is the story of the Manitous. Manitous are mysteries and spirits, the essence of ultimate reality. The major misconception of European missionaries was related to the Anishinaabe, that's how he spells it, notion of God, Basil Johnston. And Gitchimanidu has given us a different understanding, said Red Jacket, meaning different understanding from the Jesuits. The Manitou are the spirits that represent ultimate reality, a sense of God and the gods. It's also where Ojibwa cosmology comes from. And here I do want to just offer a real quick quote from Basil Johnston in his masterful study of the Manitou. Western Europeans took it for granted that Aboriginal peoples, being of simple heart and mind, believed in the presence of little spirits in rocks, trees, groves, and waterfalls, much as the primitive peoples of Europe believed in goblins, trolls, and leprechauns. Men and women who addressed the Manitous were believed to be worshiping spirits and idols out of superstition. But most Aboriginal people understood their respective languages well enough to know from the context the precise sense and meaning intended by the word Manitou or any of its other derivatives. depending on the context, they knew that in addition to spirit, the term Manitou might mean essence, transcendental, mystical, muse, patron, or divine. Therefore, when the Anishinaabe people predicated the term Manitou of God, they added the prefix Gitchi, meaning great. By this term, Gitchi Manitou, they mean properly the great mystery of the supernatural order beyond human grasp, beyond words, neither male nor female, not of the flesh, but the mystery that transcends and yet fulfills all things. What little is known of Gitchi Manitou is known through the universe, the cosmos, and the world in which we inhabit. Gitchi Manitou is the creator of all things, all beings, including the other Manitous. And then he concludes this section where he says, when the Western Europeans arrived on this continent and met the natives, they at once believed them to be heathens, who without true religion were in need of Christianity and civilized knowledge and technology. In refusing a missionary's invitation to renounce their beliefs and to espouse the beliefs of the Bible, one of the leaders, Red Jacket, said on behalf of his people, Gitchi Manitou has given us a different understanding, quote. He meant, in substance, that Gitchi Manitou had given the native people a different understanding of the nature and attributes of God, and a different sense of the nature of humanity and the world. Gitchi Manitou had already provided occasion for revelation and the enlightenment of all humankind. In other words, they weren't